The weight of the galactic prison cell's silence descended upon him, broken only by the subdued buzz of alien machinery buried in the cold antiseptic light from the walls produced harsh shadows on the scant metal surfaces. Sitting on the small ledge acting as a bed, his hands sensed shadows that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. Slung loosely on his knees, his eyes closed, concentrating his tools, but his mental training had kicked in, centering him, helping him breathe and calm his thoughts. He hadn't replayed every moment of his capture in his thoughts, analyzing their method for flaws. Confident, almost cocky, when they hauled him off the battlefield and taunted him in their foreign dialect, had no idea what he was capable of or about the many hours he had spent pushing himself outside his comfort zone. They considered him as something little, perhaps whimsically fragile given the strength of the walls, meant to let entities considerably greater than him escape. Yet as he sat, his mind computed, he looked around the inside, staring at every seam. Every corner noted the pulse of the lights and the odd flutter running across them. This was not only a holding cell but also an advanced confinement facility his captors had probably undervalued. Thinking their technology and brute force would suffice, so hubris would be his first weapon. From the minute they closed the cell door, they hadn't really checked on him. Rather, they had dispatched a guard to only glance inside. He grinned pleasantly. They believed he was imprisoned. Thus he would sit silently and wait. They knew he lacked the silent endurance of a human soldier taught to flee any scenario. He knew from experience that letting an enemy feel you were absolutely not a threat would be the best approach to defeat them. Started by noting trends every 15 minutes. A soft hiss accompanied a minor, although the ventilation system cycled the lights. Their dimming was not very significant, but it told he who controlled this prison ship never considered someone like him as power passed through here in controlled waves. He would find the small eccentricities. But they were not dealing with just anyone. He had been in harsher cells with tighter security and less prospects, but among foreign technology and overconfident guards he felt opportunity with every breath. The hours stretched on, and his thoughts kept mapping the source. Every sound measured the steps of every far-off patrol. Every shift change left its trail a minor increase of noise from a far-off corridor, the sound of mumbling foreign voices. He clung on to every detail. They would undervalue the human capacity for memory under duress. One guard stopping momentarily at his cell to examine the lock, he caught its eyes. Our multiac aided. And Chili met his for a few seconds. He could see the contemptful smile and the tilt of its head. Rumbling something in its discourse had a tone that required no translating. He met its serenity, with the guard disregarded his slight flutter of a smile on his lips. Wouldn't know they couldn't, but that was okay. He didn't need them. Their blindness was all he required. As the guard's footsteps vanished, he pressed against the wall, closely following an almost undetectable line where two panels joined. Gently sensing any change, his patience was ultimately rewarded. A hardly sensible offer at one corner. He understood enough about materials and building to identify what might be concealed there. Alien or not, ships have patterns and flaws. He pressed harder, feeling the small change. His first move would be a little flash of light caught his sight. He turned barely in time to see a crack in the wall sealing itself. The ship was fitted with intelligent adaptive repair systems. Almost everything, but he possessed a benefit not considered: human endurance or patience. Wait for the ideal moment, his desire to sit still and let his attacker believe he was defeated. Those were his real weapons. Few days went this way in a cycle of rigorous observation. Time stretched and crumpled, but he never lost focus, anchoring himself in his purpose. Every bit of data was a secret to his escape. He would wait till they were at ease, until they forgot he was even here, until the regularity became their weakness. It was only on the third night that the chance presented itself. His captors didn't visit his cell that evening. Perhaps they had become bored of gloating or considered he had given up, but for him the silence meant freedom. He pushed his hand toward the far edge of his cell. Against the little grate he had found, the weak point had taken him time to target, but the structures he pushed harder, feeling the huge giveaway under his hand. Fragility was real. He gently opens, knowing even the smallest error could start something. Alarms. He let his fingers slowly, carefully remove the grating without a sound behind it. A limited hole dug into the ship. They hadn't shut this path off, maybe believing no one would be little enough or desperate enough to try it. But he wasn't just anyone, and he was nothing if not desperate. He drew himself into the tunnel and felt the tight metal scrape against his arms. Propelled himself ahead, neglecting the claustrophobia he practiced for this practice, traversing difficult environments. His heart rate was slow and consistent. He approached an intersection, and his thoughts cleared every foot forward. Peering down a little grate below him, he could see the guard room where his captors were leisurely giggling in subdued tones, and he studied them for a moment. not knowing the language he needed to decipher. His eyes narrowing, these were the people that laughed and judged him harmless, teased him, but eventually a steady, careful blueprint started to take shape. He would not only escape, he would also cause them to fear. Him makes them repent every arrogant presumption he would apply. The shadows, the narrow passageways they ignored, would show them the gloomy corners of the ship they hardly noticed. He listened as the guards shared another Earth soldiers were not to be undervalued moving forward. Joke at his expense, then let them revel in their confidence soon. Enough would come to no fear. He would educate them just how incorrect they were when he was back in his cell. Night coming up around him, he reclined on the ledge once more, letting his breathing slow slowly. Start in earnest and sat on the brink of the small metal bench used for his sleeping. Feeling the cold of the cell pass through his old clothing, his intellect was sharper than it had ever been. Each thought was clear and computed the gaps in the guards' procedures. Every item was beginning to show in the construction. To gather into a strategy so exact that the aliens wouldn't even be aware of it until it was too late. Closing his eyes, late he remembered his training, those long days spent deep learning to fit in and move without leaving any trace in the earthly woods. Understood how to wait to track every movement every second. They would have discounted him as they couldn't imagine a human who could deliberate so carefully and with such great depth of patience that their second error, the first, had been sealing him off without considering the kind of human they were dealing with when the lights dimmed slightly to indicate the ship's nocturnal power conservation mode. He got up and walked to the wall. Investigated, he followed his fingertips over the weak, nearly imperceptible seam sensation for the give he found earlier caused his mind to go through listing every instrument he would need. Every element he could employ. Escape went beyond mere breakthrough to reflect. Staying out, and for that he must be ready with practice using accuracy. Started gathering every little object in his cell that would be useful. There was not much. A thin reinforced blanket. He had been rationing a tiny metal water cup, and the hard ledge he used as a bed. Water, drinking only as much as he needed today. He was happy for it. He took the running his fingertips down its borders. He felt the steely strength with a small touch of pressure, and the appropriate angle might be formed into something sharper, perhaps even something that might cut. His initial attempts was awkward grips, slipping. He pressed the metal cup, not letting the material bend to his will, feeling as he did. Each offer as a triumph. His captors had no knowledge of his level of will. Skilled Earth soldiers have developed in using few resources they never trained for desperational use. His advantage ultimately, after what felt like was never needed to thrive without technology supporting us. He had a rudimentary but sharp, jagged edge on the cup's rim, sufficient to be helpful. Next, he turned to turn the thin blanket, twisting at. The fibers would be plenty to trip someone, maybe enough to lock a door in place until they created a strong string. Needed it, his hands moved practically on their own, while his mind turned toward the greater image in the low light. With his homemade tools ready, every piece he created moved back to the wall, considerably closer to freedom. Putting his ear against it, listening for the tiniest sound, he had previously mentioned that guards walked past his cell in unequal tonight's intervals, were slower than normal, their weight plotted over the corridor perfect. Quiet verified that he was simply another vanquished prisoner. They were not expecting disturbance. Chewing his time for release or worse, but he had no intention of waiting. Every inch of the wall was familiar to him, and he maintained consistent breathing in time with the familiar pulse. Now, and if only slightly, he could sense exactly where the panel yielded. Eased the cup's sharp edge along the seam, gently coaxing the panel free at last. It moved just a millimeter, but sufficient to provide him a little sliver of area, a possible egress. Once he had the timing and his equipment absolutely perfect, he would go back to it. The escape route was just there. Matter of preparation, as he considered Earth's demanding days and nights while he waited for the proper opportunity. Spent in survival training, the manner they had been trained to survive hunger, cold, quiet, the way they learned to push beyond the point most would give up. Then he turned on those memories to help him focus now. He was still a soldier amid the quiet, antiseptic halls of an alien ship. Soldiers did not quit over the next few years. Days he kept his schedule, gathering data, memorizing the guard rotations down to the second. He studied. Their motions revealed which ones appeared to slink off and were lethargic. Every detail counts. Every second it might make all the difference between freedom and mental captivity. His body was razor, taut, silently docile, a prisoner fading away in a readiness his captors could not see. Silence, and he let them believe their illusion of control. By the fourth day he knew he was ready. He charted his course via the air ducts slightly above the cell. Computed his time to get to the ship's evacuation spots, using the layout he had even heard about. Bits of information gathered from the ship headed for a bigger prison colony, providing him with a chronology. Was tight he had to risk being moved tonight, instead of with the increased security waiting for him. When the fading light indicated the start of the night shift, he started moving quickly and applied the sharp edge of his metal cup to push open the wall panel, easing it loose without making noise. Slipped into the small crawl space behind the cold metal pressing against his flesh. This place felt cramped, but it flowed straight into the duct system from there, and he could negotiate the ship undetectably. He crept with deliberate stealth, dragging himself across the ducts, stopping every so often to listen. Dimness. Ship buzzed around him, unaware of the human slipping through its steel veins. His path was intentional, guiding. He required entry to the control room he had identified from the patterns he had researched. He was nearer the security room. There, he had to do it silently. At last, he came to a tiny grate. Above the room, peeking through it to view two guards seated inside, talking casually, their weapons positioned against the wall. They were lazy and exactly what he was hoping for. Had no time to spare, making the little cord from his blanket. Ready to let himself slip down, his motions exact. Deadly. Dimness. Ship buzzed around him, unaware of the human slipping through its steel veins. His path was intentional, guiding. He required entry to the control room he had identified from the patterns he had researched. He was nearer the security room. There, he had to do it silently. At last, he came to a tiny grate. Above the room, peeking through it to view two guards seated inside, talking casually, their weapons positioned against the wall. They were lazy and exactly what he was hoping for. Had no time to spare, making the little cord from his blanket. Ready to let himself slip down, his motions exact. Deadly. Quietly behind the first guard, his improvised weapon slammed violently on the alien's exposed neck. The guard stiffened, a low moan, fleeing as he was dropped without sound. Second guard was down, too shocked and unconscious, not having time to react. Working fast, he looked over the panel and identified a few being concentrated totally on his objective. He couldn't traverse his mind utilizing familiar symbols. Afford a single mistake in a few seconds and temporarily locked all of the neighboring hallways, pilfers paths to purchase extra time as he readied to depart. He felt a sense of gratification. The aliens had undervalued him. Seen as nothing more than a prisoner human, but soon enough they would know what it meant to face. They were learning. Someone trained for the impossible walked across the ship's dark hallways with fresh resolve. His strategy, he moved almost there. Gathering with every stealthy step, he was almost there. Down the ship's hallways like a shadow, silent and invisible. The temporary his lockdown in the control room had generated the anarchy he required by closing important paths and interfering with the alien. Every second counted. Guards patrolled. He maintained constant breathing and mental clarity. Totally preoccupied with his objective, escape. Faint sounds rang along the passageway as two guards murmured to one another using their guttural alien tongue. They're talking about the lockdown, annoyance in their voice. The uncertainty he created wasn't spreading either. Realize how their systems might be hacked. It would not be possible for a human to negotiate their advanced technology with such simplicity, yet blinded them from understanding the truth he was guiding them toward. Their conceit was still blinding. Squeezed himself against the wall, sliding into a dark corner, allowing the guards to pass just inches from him, though he resisted it at the time. His want to strike was great. Depending on precision to remain undetectable as long as he started an open conflict. Once they were gone, his choices would become limited, and he would forward. He mentally projected the complex but logical design of the ship through a sequence of maintenance corridors. A trait of extraterrestrial efficiency he could take advantage of was secret passageways linking several areas of the ship, very certainly utilized for quick fixes and supply channels. His familiarity with the design from observation hours turned into his advantage, and he arrived in a wider corridor. One that directly resulted in the energy hub. He required access to a power connector. If he could control the energy output of the ship, even momentarily could generate a window long enough to disable the security systems of although the scheme was dangerous, depending on split-second timing. He had no other choice. The energy. Of course, hub was secured. He counted 3 aliens positioned outside their posture slack. Not sure of any immediate danger, they appeared assured in technology, at ease in their view that none human could outsmart them. He watched them momentarily, noting their weaponry. Their places were elites educated in warfare, but not used in surprises he could use against them. Moving stealthily, he grabbed the makeshift tools he had ready. He would created a crude throwing weapon out of fragments from the cell paneling, honed just enough to create, though it wasn't much. Distraction would let him shoot deliberately. Throwing it down the hall, where it cluttered against the metal, calling the guards' immediate attention. turned their rifles ready, but their backs were toward him. He slipped quickly behind them using their split focus in two swift, accurate punches disarmed the first guard, sending him crumpling to the floor the second round late. His weapon rose in surprise as the human moved with a deadly accuracy not expected. In seconds, the guards were down, rendered disabled before they could warn anyone. He spent little time entering the energy hub and locked the chamber door behind him. Throbbed with the force driving the whole spacecraft, alien symbols flashing in intricate patterns. AC Ross the control. He inhaled deeply to help the alien tech to ground herself. Advance, but he had spent days learning the fundamentals of their systems. His knowledge was not flawless, but it did not. Maybe he simply required a brief spike powerful enough to produce a. He found the main console, sensing heat radiating from a little power overload from the machinery all around him. His deliberate finger movements across the controls turned switches and changing the parameters. Depending on his observations, the system rejected, sending error signals he couldn't understand. Still, he persisted in pushing the power levels to their maximum, ignoring protections. He drove the reactor toward overload, and the hum got louder as he had seconds, perhaps less, before the alarm set off. A countdown showed strange digits he couldn't read, but he didn't must. He sensed the surge developing, the IM pulse of vitality that would ripple. He went quickly across the ship, slipping out of the energy hub just as the power variation peaked. The lights across the ship dimmed, and he felt low rumble underneath. Alarms blared, far yells reverberated down. The alien team hurried through the hallways to fix the issue they believed to be a technical one, a flaw in their system. They were unaware it was all controlled every instant of. He moved through the hallways undetectably, pandemonium planned with the lights darkened. As the crew worked to bring order back, he could hear bewilderment in the voices around him toward the docking bay. Panic. He maintained his focus fixed and moved deliberately. He was near now, only steps. Two more elites, unlike the others, guarded the docking port doors away from the docking port. Looked anxious. They had probably heard of the disturbance and were on great alert, anticipating danger. He took a long breath, evaluating his choices here. The direct path was not one available. He had to outsmart them. He watched the door lock, a sophisticated system needing a key card, and his head ran. Remembering one of the guards from past, he dug into his pocket and pulled the little flat key card he had seized. He would almost forgot about it in the hurry, but now he slid the card gently, approaching silently. The door clicked open to the reader, and the guards heard the commotion, turning around. Weapons lifted, but he slid across the door, closing behind before they could respond. The docking bay opened out before him, rows of elegant alien ships running along the walls. He looked about and found little escape pods close to the far end. Simplified, meant for an emergency, ideal. He moved fast, knowing he was pressed for time. The power fluctuation wouldn't last very long once it steadied. They knew just as he was climbing into the closest pod, his hands gliding over the controls, familiarizing himself with the arrangement. The symbols were in, but they were different. Felt the pod vibrate as it turned on, realizing enough to grasp the fundamentals, and started the launch sequence. Outside, the soldiers saw Al was walking in faint footsteps. He had passed their defenses. The pod trembled, then ignited the engines, feeling the force pushing him into his seat. Sliding the docking bay doors, he rocketed ahead, breaking free from the expanse of the ship. He was out. Yet glancing back, he could see the safety yet not yet alien ship in the distance, its sleek form slicing across the void. He knew they would follow for hunting. He embraced it, even though he downed them for the embarrassment he caused them to chase. He let them to recover their prisoner. They never know the fortitude that propelled a human being. He would show them only a taste of what it would take to survive against all odds. Meant to be underestimated, and sensed a strong sensation of as he floated farther into space. Understanding they never repeat that error, the escape pod buzzed. Its engine consistent, feeding the nothingness of space, kept a measured distance from the alien. Prison ship. He observed the view screen tracking ship movements as expected. The aliens were organizing. He hadn't expected him to make it thus far. But now that he knew his pod wouldn't outrun them. Their pride wouldn't allow it. Long extraterrestrial crafts were intended for speed and endurance, unlike the emergencies. Because he was now flying, but he only needed to outrun them long enough to perform the following phase of action. He didn't have to run endlessly. His scheme turned on the pod's navigational system, computing coordinates for an asteroid belt close by. Though risk was something he had become used to, in truth, he thrived on it behind him. Prison ship was acquiring. They had dispatched 2 smaller ship scouts capable of closing the distance faster than the primary vessel. He followed their same technique on the scanner. He corrected the pod's speed. They had no idea he was guiding them into a trap. He approached the asteroid field, slowing just enough to give the scouts hope he was frightened and miscalculated his escape route. Let them believe it. He directed the pod toward the field's edge, sliding between the large pebbles that floated in. Still here, among the thick trash, he would find shelter. Use the scouts. Tracked their engines roaring as they negotiated, the field lasers pulsating in his direction, veering left just barely. He focused on dodging a blast that burnt the pods. The small cabin smelled burning metal. Totally on timing, trained for this precise situation on Earth to meet the precision needed to survive this gauntlet. Soaring across canyons between challenges under fire, weaving between barriers. One of the scout ships was finding that their grandeur was working against them now. Their huge ships were straining. Tried to cut him off straight ahead and noticed the pilot was extraterrestrial. Face full of scorn, expecting him to give up, he pushed on, directing his pod in a rapid steep drop. The scout followed hard, but its size turned against it. The pilot discovered the error too late as the scout turned to evade, and since it clipped the large rock, tearing off a portion of its wing, sending it whirling off. He watched the scout veer madly and managed a little smile. Smashing another asteroid with a silent burst of light, one down, but he wasn't done yet. The second scout ship was closing in, this one more sensibly, avoiding the pilot had acquired from the first scout failure distance knowledge about the rocks. Focusing his lasers precisely, he understood these aliens still depended too much on their technology and never confronted a human in open space like this. He saw someone who could use the very terrain against them. Big asteroid with sharp edges and fissures on its surface. If timed using this right, he could propel the pod's engines to maximum speed toward the asteroid, therefore benefiting himself. If he meant to wreck the second scout, he followed growing speed to match him. He jerked the pod's controls at the last possible second to send it into a tight spin, hugging the asteroid's surface the alien ship aimed toward. But the maneuver was too sharp too. The engines of the scout ship flared as it tried to correct. But it was too late. The scout grazed the asteroid's hull, opening in a burst of sparks. Before it too broke, he pulled the pod. She left only fragments in her path. Out of the spin, the main prison ship was still on his trail. He was steadying himself. Its weight too great to negotiate the asteroid field. The alien commander must have come to see that for now sending more scouts will only mean more deaths. He maneuvered the pod farther into the field, looking for a little hollowed asteroid during a few breathing pauses. Where he might dock and review. When he found a steady ground, he deactivated the engines, allowing the pod to drift in silence. Surrounded by the deep shadows of the rocks, he could relax for a minute. His mind already was working, computing his then. Amid the silence, he remembered Earth and the years of survival training to help negotiate unfriendly terrain. Devoid of his intellect, had perceived him as delicate. Small, yet they lacked the depth of human resiliency, the will to blaze like a calm fire. The scanner beeped gently, steady and relentless, jerking him back to the still prowling outside. The asteroid field was the prison ship. Their urge to capture him to save face caused him to be undervalued, and now they couldn't stand the concept of a simple person outsmarting their pride. His weapon of choice looked at the pod systems. Although his supplies almost ran out, he had just noticed the limited fuel. He knew he couldn't get far with enough force for one more burst, but he only needed to perform one last action, turning on the pod's navigation assigned coordinates, using what would, though it was a risky action, take him around the asteroid field, looking on the other side from the prison ship. If he timed it correctly, he could pass their notice and run out of cautious choices. Covering it with the asteroids was a chance, but all he had learned had equipped him for this kind of danger. He put in the command, felt the lurch as it turned on once more, directed it across the field, maintaining low. As he approached the edge, the prison ship loomed nearer. Unfortunately, its scanners pointed in the wrong direction. They were still exploring the asteroid field's depths, ignorant he was sliding right under their feet as he cleared the area, accelerating the pod to its maximum capacity, thus guiding the alien ship. At last found him with blazing alarms, turning to intercept. He built enough distance, enough momentum. The prison ship's SPL worked against it, slowing it down, giving him the head start. He could see open space ahead, the great openness of the void extending behind him. Prison ship's engines flared in desperation. It was too late. He'd outrun them, outsmitted them. Realizing he was free, he exhaled the tension. Nevertheless, he knew this was not the end they would be returning from. Let him go so naturally. He had no fantasies regarding what awaited him. He was still a pursued man, a target signified by a strong extraterrestrial energy. But that didn't matter. They could pursue him all they desired. Their hubris would be evident. He would have shown them what a human could achieve. As he floated into the stars, he sensed a calm satisfaction, certain that ran deeper than any fear. They may undervalue him, trash him, but they never know the depth of human resilience, never comprehend the fire keeping him moving ahead, and he knew he would keep on facing whatever, as long as the fire blazed. Coming next, meet it head-on, as he was human, and that alone, not only a prisoner escaping captivity, made him unstoppable. The stars silently and endlessly stretched out in every direction. He knew his calm would not be long, as the Allen prison ship was still following him. Even if he had escaped its immediate grasp, they wouldn't cease. He'd have embarrassed them where none else had, and it made him a symbol of disobedience their pride wouldn't allow. He adjusted the pod systems, looking for any last fuel reserves, and rerouting power to vital navigation. The fuel gauge blinked a severe red low and rapidly declining. He would 30 minutes, perhaps an hour at most. He needed a plan, otherwise he would be aimlessly floating in the vacuum. Quick, his eye turned to the nav panel. He had extracted certain coordinates from the database of the prison ship returned in the control room, just in case. A list of mining sites and distant outposts where he could find refuge most too far. One, a little asteroid station on the fringe of alien space, was within reach. He might hide group there, perhaps even locate the tools he required, but the outpost probably belonged to the same alien faction. Thus he would have to deal with more of them, yet he lacked options. Danger he would have to pay for entering the coordinates and guiding the pod toward last stores of gasoline. The pod trembled, its engines groaning as it propelled the little vehicle, cutting over the darkness behind him. Could feel the prison ship still searching, still closing, so he forced himself to stay quiet, steady. As he approached the station, he observed its construction rising from the shadows formed into the side of a big asteroid shines softly against the darkness. It was small, presuming the sort of location utilized for minor trade and peaceful refueling. Perfect. He brought the pod to a gradual approach, looking for indications of, if he were lucky, the place would be vacant or at least lightly manned. Luck, but it was not in his best advantage. He noticed 3 little ships kept on the platform. There a few individuals moved about the station carrying supplies and clearly alien designs, maintaining. He inhaled deeply, then computed his approach. Charging in would just trap him or worse, but maybe if he performed this well, he could use their own arrangement against them. Let the pod float a little closer before entirely shutting it off, leaving just emergency systems covered him with darkness, hiding his presence. From every fundamental scan he saw in search of his chance to learn. After a while he noticed his chance among the alien patterns moving between the station and their spacecraft. One little single pilot craft left unattended, its ramp lowered open for loaded. He realized he had just seconds to move, turning on the pod's thrusters for a brief blast. He drew it to the station as near as he could, then make use of the remaining power to his only means off this rock was to lock the pod into position on the side of the asteroid where it would remain out of sight. Now within that extraterrestrial ship, he stealthily ascended from the pod and traveled along the shaded side of the asteroid, approaching the port sounds like unaware of the human form sliding toward their ship. Alien whispers floated through the scant atmosphere the crew knew of. Steps were light, planned, his motions merging with the shadows. The alien guards paid no attention. He arrived to the ship. They concentrated on their chores. Slipping down the ramp and into the tiny cockpit, his fingers glided over the controls, looking at the unknown. Though his understanding of their systems was still poor, he memorized enough from the prison ship to make sense of the principles. He started the engine sequence, feeling the power surge across the craft as the system came to life. Dimly lit cockpit, he watched the aliens outside, waiting for the precise moment to act as one of the guards turned. His eyes grew wide when he saw the human seated at the controls, raising a hand, screaming. But it was too late. He turned on the engines, and the ship lurched forward, releasing off the platform. Alarms blared in a flash as the surviving crew scrambled. But he was already gone, dragging the ship into the open vacuum. The station shrank behind him. The stars stretched out as he separated himself from the alien outpost, almost feel their annoyance at his escape once more. But he couldn't let himself unwind just yet. The prison ship was probably still in pursuit. This stolen ship was only a temporary fix. He checked the controls, looking for a navigation interface. The coordinates he had recorded earlier revealed a remote system on the brink of alien space. Unmonitored and probably uninhabited, if he could reach there, he would have a chance to vanish, at least momentarily. His fingers slid across the controls, guiding the ship into a quicker path. Felt the acceleration push him back, the stars blurring somewhat. The alien systems were more in line as he accelerated. Advanced more than anything he had used on Earth, but his training made him flexible. Every second counted as he stretched the craft's capabilities. but as he rushed away, his scanners flashed a warning. His huge bolt closing on the prison ship had been seen faster than he had expected. He watched as they neared the gap shrank in spite of his efforts. Relentless resolve to stop, he realized he could not outrun them. He would have to outmaneuver them, flip the terribly empty of space into his ally. He looked around for anything wherever to hide at last. Saw a tiny dense nebula, whose energy levels fell off the scale. If he could hide his existence at least long enough to avoid their scans without thinking, then change. The ship answered immediately, its engines flashing as he pointed it straight for the nebula. Thick cloud of interstellar dust surrounded him. The prison ship slowed down behind him. Though aware of the dangers of approaching such an unstable environment, they were near the edge. He did not hesitate. Dropped into the nebula, the energy waves dancing about him. The scanners glitched, trying to adjust the static in the cockpit. As he negotiated the thick cloud, the prison ship loomed, pressed on, weaving behind its scanner, seeking to find him through the nebula's interference. Feeling the strength of the storm pulse about him, then, as he approached the nebula's heart, through the choppy waves, noticed it, a little rocky planet tucked away in the storm. It was uninhabitable. Though it was his opportunity, the surface of the ship was covered in jagged mountains and vast craters, angled downward, falling into the atmosphere. He felt the heat of re-entry as he passed the surface. He steered the ship into a little canyon, hiding his existence with the topography. The prison ship hovered above, examining warily, but he stayed hidden. His ship nestled gently behind the natural protection of the earth, for now he was safe, sitting in the cockpit, the alien engines fading into silence. Silence. He let himself breathe. He was free, shielded from their reach, and escaped. Finally, he proved what they had missed to grasp, that a human's volition was an infinitely strong power. Strong.